Eli Granger didn't say much in school, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he'd long since learned that no one really wanted to hear it. At Briar Creek High, kids like him were just background noise, easy targets, easy laughs. Every morning, he'd walk through the school gates with his head down and shoulders hunched beneath the same old jacket he wore every day. A frayed, faded green military coat that hung off his narrow frame like it once belonged. To someone twice his size, it had a rip at the elbow, a few mismatched buttons, and a strange patch stitched to the shoulder, black thread against olive drab, a symbol no one recognized. Some of the other students called it the thrift store uniform. Others, less kind, called it hobo armor. But to Eli, it was the only thing that made him feel close to someone who mattered. His grandfather, Jack Granger, had worn that jacket long before Eli was born. Jack rarely spoke about his time in the military, except in fragments, broken stories, told between sips of coffee and long stares out the window. After a stroke had confined Jack to a wheelchair, Eli had become his hands and feet, running errands, fixing what he could, and walking to school in the old jacket when winter came. It wasn't much, but it was something. On the bus and in the hallways, whispers followed Eli like a bad smell. "Hey, Granger," one kid jeered one morning. "The Army surplus store called. They want their trash back." A few others laughed, but Eli didn't respond. He never did. Instead, he tucked his hands into the sleeves and stared at the floor, counting the tiles under his feet, until the teasing passed. That Friday, everything changed. The school had organized a Veterans Day assembly, inviting local service members and officials to speak to the students. Rows of restless teenagers slumped in folding chairs while men in uniform took the stage. Eli sat near the back, as always, trying to disappear. Halfway through the event, General Marcus Albright, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and widely respected, took the microphone to give a speech about honor, sacrifice, and forgotten heroes. As his eyes scanned the crowd, they caught something that made him falter: the jacket. More specifically, the patch. Eli didn't notice at first, but others did when the general stopped mid-sentence. He stepped down from the stage slowly, eyes locked on Eli's shoulder like he was seeing a ghost. Murmurs rippled through the auditorium as he approached. "Son," General Albright said quietly, kneeling slightly to Eli's eye level. "Where? Did you get that jacket?" Eli blinked, caught off guard. "It was my grandfather's," he said. "He gave it to me." The general's face changed, like something long buried had just clawed its way back to the surface. And that was the moment everything started to change. Eli could still feel the echo of the general's eyes on him long after the assembly ended. The tall man in uniform hadn't just looked at him. He had stared, jaw slack, like he'd seen a ghost. The rest of the students were already filing out of the gym, buzzing about summer plans and the dullness of the Veterans Day speech. But Eli stood frozen, his hand clutching the strap of his worn-out backpack. The jacket suddenly felt heavier on his shoulders, the frayed collar scratching against his neck. "Excuse me, son." The voice was deep, commanding, but not unkind. Eli turned. General Marcus Albright stood a few feet away, flanked by two other military officers who exchanged uncertain glances. "That jacket you're wearing," Albright said, approaching slowly. "Where did you get it?" Eli hesitated. "It was my grandpa's," he mumbled. "He gave it to me a few years ago. I wear it pretty much every day." The general's eyes dropped to the faded patch on the left shoulder, a jagged, almost triangular insignia stitched in dark thread. It looked like it had been sewn back on by hand. Most people didn't even notice it, but the general had. He reached out, fingers trembling just slightly, and brushed the patch with a touch that bordered on reverence. "I haven't seen this in over 30 years, he whispered. "Not since the desert." Eli frowned. "What do you mean?" Albright didn't answer right away. He gestured for the two officers to give him a moment, then turned back to Eli with an intensity that made the boy's pulse quicken. "What's your name, son?" Eli Brogan." "Brogan," Albright murmured. "What's your grandfather's name?" "Thomas Brogan." The general took a sharp breath. "Tommy Brogan?" Eli nodded, confused. "You knew him?" Albright stepped back, looking like he'd been hit with a wave of memories. "I didn't just know him. Your grandfather saved my life. He saved all of us. Eli blinked. But Grandpa never talks about the war. He won't even tell me where he served. Albright nodded slowly. That's because we weren't supposed to exist. He looked around, then placed a firm hand on Eli's shoulder. Come with me. They ended up in the principal's office. Albright had pulled rank, politely but firmly, and within minutes Eli was sitting in a leather chair as the general. Shut the door behind them. I owe you an explanation, Albright said. You see, back in 1985, your grandfather and I were part of a Black Ops unit, Deep Recon. We weren't supposed to leave any trace. Our missions were off the books, deniable, invisible. The patch on your jacket? That was our unit's symbol. No name, no number, just that shape. Eli looked down at the triangular mark. So, my grandpa was some kind of secret agent? Albright chuckled. Not quite James Bond, but close. He was a tracker. The best I've ever seen. We were in the mountains of the Middle East when everything went sideways. Ambush, betrayal, extraction, botched. Half the team was wiped out. The rest of us were captured, all except for your grandfather. What did he do? He came back, Albright said. Alone. Crossed 50 miles of enemy terrain. Found us. Rescued us one by one. He got me out of a hole in the ground with a broken leg and a gunshot wound. Carried me on his back for 2 days with no food, no rest. Eli's eyes widened. But he never told anyone? He couldn't. The operation was buried. Politically inconvenient. The government disavowed us to keep the mission from reaching the press. Your grandfather was told to disappear. No medals, no records, just silence. Eli felt a burning, sensation rising in his chest, pride, disbelief, and a creeping sense of injustice. He always said the past should stay in the past, Eli said quietly. Albright's face softened. He's a man of deep honor, but what happened to him wasn't right. We owe him more than a memory. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small photograph, faded, black and white. 5 men in combat gear stood side by side, dirt-covered and battle-worn. One of them, younger, leaner, but unmistakable, was Thomas Brogan. Eli took the photo in shaking hands. That patch, Albright said, pointing, was sewn by one of our team members. It meant we were family. When we were erased, the symbol disappeared too. Only a few of us even kept it. Eli swallowed hard. He gave it to me when I got bullied in middle school. Said if I wore it, I'd never be alone. Albright looked at him for a long time. You're not, he said. That evening, Eli returned home to the small house he shared with his grandfather and mother. The lights were dim, as always, and the television murmured in the living room. Thomas Brogan sat in his usual chair, slippers on, crossword in hand. Eli dropped his bag and walked slowly toward him. He didn't know what to say at first, how to begin a conversation with a man who had buried a war and a life of sacrifice behind silence. Grandpa? Thomas looked up, his eyes tired but kind. Yeah, kiddo. I met General Albright. Today. The pencil froze in his hand. He saw the patch, Eli continued. Said you saved him, that you saved them all. There was a long, brittle pause. Then the old man put down the pencil and leaned back in his chair. That damn patch, he muttered. I should have cut it off years ago. But why didn't you? Thomas glanced at the television, then at Eli. Because it reminded me that even if nobody knew what we did, we did. We remembered each other. That's all that ever mattered. Don't you want people to know? Thomas let out a slow sigh. What I want doesn't change the past, but maybe it's time. Eli sat beside him, the old photo in his pocket, his heart heavy with things unsaid and truths newly discovered. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, for the first time in years, Thomas Brogan began to talk. Eli couldn't sleep that night. The jacket, his grandfather's jacket, lay folded at the end of his bed like a quiet question mark. Only now it didn't feel like just a relic. It felt like something sacred, something heavy. That old patch, rough at the edges and bleached, by the sun, had stirred something far larger than Eli could have imagined. Earlier that day, General Marcus Albright had come back, not with fanfare or a convoy, but quietly, in a civilian car, wearing a dark coat and somber expression. He'd asked to see Eli and his grandfather, Mr. Henry Dawson, in private. They sat in the small living room where the furniture was old, and the wallpaper peeled at the corners. The general had barely touched his coffee. He didn't make small talk. "Mr. Dawson," he'd said, voice low but urgent, "I believe we served together. Operation Echo Hill, 1974. Eli had watched the color drain from his grandfather's face. His eyes, usually dull from years of chronic pain and forgotten memories, sharpened like glass under pressure. "I don't know what you're talking about," Henry had muttered. The general didn't press. Not at first. But then he turned to Eli. "Your grandfather saved." Eli blinked. "Ghost. Platoon, his..." But then he turned to Eli. "Your grandfather saved 12 men that night, myself included. We were ambushed in the wrong valley. Bad intel. That patch on the jacket, it belonged to Ghost Platoon, a unit that technically never existed. That patch shouldn't exist either." Eli blinked. Ghost Platoon? His grandfather stood abruptly, the cup of coffee rattling in his hand. "This conversation's over. Sir," Albright said gently, "you were erased, and it wasn't by accident." Those words hung like smoke in the air long after the general left. Eli paced his room the next morning. Every word from the night before replayed in his mind, but one thing echoed the loudest. You were erased. How? Why? Henry Dawson had always been a mystery to Eli. He barely spoke of the war, only muttering fragments of stories under his breath when he thought no one was listening. For years, Eli assumed it was just trauma, maybe regret. But now it felt like something darker, something deliberate. Eli couldn't take it anymore. He tiptoed down to the living room. His grandfather sat in his old recliner, watching the muted television with a blank stare. On the coffee table sat a dusty cigar box, something Eli had never seen before. He approached slowly, heart thudding. "Gramps," he said, "did you really save those men?" Henry didn't respond at first. Then, without looking at him, he whispered, "I wasn't supposed to come back." The words were so soft, Eli almost missed them. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we were sent in as bait," he said, voice cracking. "Ghost Platoon was real, but we weren't supposed to succeed. We were a distraction while the real mission played out in the north. They figured we were expendable." Eli sat down beside him, stunned. "They told us it was a scouting mission. But the whole thing was a setup. We found that out too late. Our comms were cut. Half the men died in the first ambush. The rest, we fought our way out through the jungle. I carried one man for 4 miles. Henry looked at Eli now, eyes wet. That man was Marcus Albright. Eli's throat tightened. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "I did." He looked down. "But the brass covered it up. Said Ghost Platoon didn't exist. Our names were scrubbed. They said I'd face charges if I spoke out. Said I disobeyed direct orders. I was 22, scared and tired, so I shut up, moved here, raised your mom, buried the war." Silence wrapped around them like fog. "But why now?" Eli asked. "Why is General Albright bringing this up after all these years?" His grandfather hesitated. "Because something's changed. Maybe he's tired of carrying it, or maybe he sees a chance to set it right." That week, journalists began calling the house. Military historians. Even the Department of Defense reached out, curious about the resurfaced Ghost Platoon insignia. Eli's life turned upside down overnight. Once mocked for his jacket, he was now the center of a storm he didn't ask for. He went from cafeteria whispers to national headlines. And through it all, his grandfather stayed quiet, watchful. The story grew. General Albright publicly confirmed Ghost Platoon. More veterans came forward with similar stories, suddenly emboldened. A hidden page in military history was unfolding, and at the heart of it stood a wounded old man and his teenage grandson. But not everyone was thrilled. One morning, a black car parked across from their house. It never left. Then came the anonymous phone calls. Then the veiled threats, "Some stories are better left buried." Eli knew they were in danger, but he also knew something else. His grandfather didn't wear that jacket anymore. Now Eli did, not out of fashion or defiance, but out of duty. What started as a joke among bullies was now a symbol of unfinished justice. The patch that had once been mocked in the school hallway was now a question the world was finally demanding an answer to, but the truth would come at a cost. And Eli was just beginning to understand how high that cost might be. The storm started with a patch. Eli sat in the passenger seat of General Albright's black SUV, watching the countryside rush past in gray smears of rain. In his lap lay the jacket, faded, worn, and stained with time. His grandfather hadn't said a word since the confrontation the night before, only handing over the jacket with trembling hands and whispering, "Be careful what you learn." Now, the general was taking him to a decommissioned military base, 2 hours outside town. It wasn't on any map, but Albright insisted it held answers. Eli didn't argue. Something about the man's haunted eyes and the urgency in his voice made Eli trust him, even if it scared him. Inside the old base, behind a locked file room, the general opened a sealed folder and laid it on the table. "Operation Sand Viper," Albright said grimly. "Top secret, Middle East 1989. Your grandfather's unit, Ghost Platoon. Classified so deep, most Pentagon officers don't even know it existed. They weren't just soldiers. They were erasers, sent to clean up what couldn't be cleaned diplomatically. But something went wrong." Eli leaned in, staring at the black and white photographs. One showed a group of young men in desert camouflage. One of them looked eerily like his grandfather, only younger and fiercer. Another was Albright himself. "There was an ambush," the general continued, "but the intel was bad. We weren't supposed to be there. A mole fed us false coordinates. Half the unit died. Your grandfather saved my life. Carried me 5 miles under fire." "Why was it covered up?" Eli asked. "Because the mission violated multiple treaties. We weren't even supposed to be in that territory. The government disavowed us. Anyone who spoke up was buried in paperwork or buried literally." Eli's stomach twisted. So my grandfather's silence wasn't loyalty, it was survival. The general nodded. And fear. He saw his best friends die. Saw command sell them out. As the revelation spread, so did the danger. Days after the visit, Eli found their home ransacked, files missing, a message scrawled on the kitchen wall. "Let the past stay buried." Reporters started sniffing around. Veterans, who'd been silent for decades, began calling, some with stories, others with warnings. Then the phone rang at midnight. The general had been reassigned without explanation, his office cleared out, his email wiped. "They're closing ranks," he told Eli in a hushed voice. "Someone up high doesn't want this coming out. And your grandfather, they might come for him next." Eli looked down at the jacket in his hands. The patch was small, barely visible, but its story was bigger than any uniform could carry. This wasn't just about honoring his grandfather anymore. It was about justice, about truth, even if it meant putting a target on his own back. He zipped up the jacket. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like armor. Eli blinked. Ghost Platoon? His